Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have the absolute pleasure and honor of having with us the great Richard Haines. Welcome, Richard.
James, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. And, it's so great to have you on here. I came across your work personally in around 2007. And, when I was going across YouTube and I found the Disclosure Project witness testimony, and I had, thankfully I had seen you on there. So that's when you first caught my attention with your work.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was because, obviously you sounded incredibly intelligent and knew what you were talking about. But when I looked up your background, I was just incredibly impressed in that, somebody of your caliber was involved in investigating and studying the UFO phenomenon. So you're actually a PhD. So for people listening, can you describe a little bit of your background?
Sure. Sure. I did graduate work at Michigan State University on the subject of how light scatters within the human eye, and way back in the 60s. And I said to myself, I'm never going to find a job. Who needs that? How important is that? And come to find out, I received a postdoctoral fellowship with the National Research Council out of Washington, and it was located at a NASA test center out in California called Ames Research Center. And so what I did there, and they asked me to do, was to design and build a vision research lab that we could simulate the way things look to the astronauts in space. They needed that for the Gemini program, the Apollo program, of course. They just finished the Mercury program. And so this laboratory involved a surgical clean room, very clean air, and a solar simulator that would put real sunlight into this dark room, black walls and so forth, and to look at rendezvous and docking kinds of issues related to Gemini, two-man capsule, by the way. And lo and behold, I discovered a light scatter within the human eye is important. And in fact, it was very important to the astronauts going into space. So I could talk for a long time, and I'm sure you don't want me to, but that's how I got started.
Yeah. So, you're a NASA research scientist. You worked on the Gemini and Apollo programs, but you were also involved in things like NARCAP and you have something called AirCat. So also for the guests listening, you published a number of books on UFOs, some that are not easy to get nowadays because I suspect they're out of print, but some of them were Project Delta, another book called Observing UFOs, another one which I found incredibly intriguing by the title, which I do want to get into, is called The UFO Phenomenon and the Behavioral Scientist. And of course, you published a book called CE-5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. And so that's kind of a vast subject. You have a lot of really important work there. But just to start off with that, again, you're a NASA research scientist. How did you end up looking at UFOs?
Okay, that's a good question. I've been asked that question many times. In the process of researching flight displays in cockpits, airplanes, I was involved in a number of flight simulator research projects at NASA in California, where I had an opportunity to talk with and meet a lot of commercial airline pilots, because NASA would hire them to come in for research purposes to fly the simulator for research. And oftentimes I would be permitted to fly co-pilot seat and to handle flaps and gear and other cockpit controls so that they could concentrate on flying the airplane or whatever the task was. And after we are done flying the simulator, they'd oftentimes come back to my office for whatever reason, to say goodbye or to pick up some a briefcase they left there or whatever. And I just happened to ask them in their flying career, had they ever seen anything they couldn't identify? And I didn't expect any positive answers. I was kind of a skeptic at that point, not really believing in the reality of this whole thing. But it wasn't very long before I started meeting pilots who started telling me these strange stories that made no sense to me. From a science point of view, they didn't fit. And so that's how I kind of got baptized, so to speak, got started in the aviation end of things. I had done some field research before that, but those were ground observers, lights in the night sky sort of thing. Almost no information content there. But when you talk to a pilot, you are flooded with information, and it's valuable information. And he's flying an airplane, usually with a lot of instrumentation on it, a lot of frequency dependent or related information that might relate to the phenomenon. And so that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question. That was my initial initiation that led to NARCAP.
Yeah, and again, it's such an important topic, nowadays, because you have a number of Navy and military pilots coming forward saying that they have witnessed UFOs, and subsequently the United States footage, the gun camera footage came out from the Nimitz incident and the gimbal and the go fast videos, which people are still debating because of they're trying to explain the videos, and apparently the United States Pentagon has more information, but they're not releasing it because it's classified. So we're in that kind of difficult situation. But I'm sure you dealt with a little. Had you spoken to both military and public pilots, so you got to see both sides of it?
Sure, and private pilots and test pilots too. Sure, the whole gamut, right?
And was there ever a time, I guess, when you're dealing with a military witness and they're like, they can't divulge certain information because it's classified?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And I made it a point in my career not to delve into those areas, not only because they wouldn't say anything to me, but that might be a liability for me professionally. So I just didn't do it.
Right. So speaking of the flight safety issue, how did you get involved with NARCAP?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was back in about 1999, and I met with a young man by the name of Ted Roe, and he had a very interesting experience himself with two other adults with him at the same time. And after he told me his story, I was very intrigued, and I continued to look into it and interview all three witnesses. We got to talking over coffee one day. What could we do to contribute to ufology? It was called ufology back then, that would have a practical basis. Much of ufology has been very passive, very self-oriented, and didn't seem to give anything back to society. It was usually motivated by curiosity. And so we came up with this idea, well, how about flight safety? Because so many Americans fly, so many people in the world fly, that if we could find a relationship between this phenomena in any of its forms and flight safety, we might be able to make flying safer. And so that's basically how we began. And it grew from there. And we realized, because of the quality of the reports we were getting, that we were really onto something. And so Ted became the executive director, and I took over the position of chief scientist. And so we gathered a team of experts in many areas because we didn't want this to be a typical UFO organization. And in fact, we took steps to keep our distance from UFO organizations. On the other hand, we wanted to be close to, like the NTSB, for instance, National Transportation Safety Board, since they do a lot of investigations of accidents and near misses and so forth. And to stay close to the Aviation Safety Reporting System at NASA, since they receive routinely a lot of incident and accident reports from pilots and air crew and air traffic controllers and anyone involved in the aviation community. And so with this kind of group of meteorologists, physicists, astronomer, human factors, psychologists, we had a team that could evaluate cases. And so we started to receive some really interesting cases. And in almost every case, we published it, wrote it up and analyzed it, published it, and put it out on the internet for anybody to have. We didn't cover anything up.
Yeah. And actually, you had a number of events. I do want to shift gears now a little bit and talk about your CE-5 book.
Okay.
So how did that come about? How did it become that Dr. Richard Haines wrote about CE-5?
Okay. I met Stephen Greer at a conference in Colorado years and years ago, and he had pretty much just established SETI.
Yeah.
You're familiar with that?
Yep.
Okay. And we got to talking, and I was impressed by the proactive approach he was using. It wasn't passive. He wasn't waiting for the phenomena to come to him on its own, but rather to use human ingenuity to try to signal somehow the phenomenon and cause a meeting, if you will, or an approach, close proximity on the basis of what the human did. So the human's in charge, so to speak, up to a point at least. And I said to myself, that makes sense. That is an intelligent approach, even if you don't agree with some of the dimensions of what he was dimensions, wrong word. Some of the approaches he was using,
yeah,
to cause the encounter, so to speak. And then he asked me to serve on his executive advisory board, which I did for a while and learned more about SETI and so forth. And I realized that no one up to that time had done a rather systematic review of the literature. Are there any cases published of that kind? And you could point to some, but not very many. And so I started looking at the evidence, basically, in the published literature, and I was shocked because cases started popping up from many, many different countries, time zones, religious backgrounds didn't matter, racial heritage didn't matter. That the CE-5 approach is something that seemed to catch on just to the human psyche, the earthling psyche. So I started collecting them and writing them up in chapter, different sections of the book, trying to look for patterns, trying to see what I could extract out of them. What do they have in common? How do they differ, and so forth. And I discovered some really interesting findings, which I'll be glad to share with you if you want. That's up to you.
Yeah, I'd love to. And, for people watching and listening, I have the book right here. This book is historical, in my opinion, because it's, oftentimes I think people throw out the baby with the bathwater in regards to CE-5 because they hear the name Stephen Greer and they have a knee-jerk reaction. And I understand that. I totally understand that. And again, some of the way he explains it could sound far out to somebody.
Sure.
But in, there's some kind of process or, in some way the human, Earth human could be the participant in somehow getting a response from UFO intelligence.
Sure.
Or, actually would, based on, I don't know if you would change your definition. I think in the book here, it says, a close encounter of the fifth kind refers to any reported experience of deliberate human behavior that was soon followed by an obvious response from a UFO and or humanoid, and which included other effects suggesting it was not coincidental. In short, human initiated contact. Would you revise that at all today?
No, not at all. James, one of the things that I looked at rather closely was the time domain. How much time happens between A and B and C and D?
Yeah.
And let me give you an example. That if you are in a dark room, pitch black room, and there's a large mirror on the opposite wall from you, but you have a flashlight, and you flash your flashlight into that mirror into Morse code. If let's say you know Morse code, you will get an immediate response back, and it will be an identical reply to what you have sent, but it's only a reflection of yourself. And so I eliminated any case where there was an immediate reply back from the phenomenon. There had to be a delay, I think 5 seconds or more, which says that either they have the ability to store and then replay, or they're initiating their own response back to you. And what I'm looking for is signs of intelligence. To me, this is one of the most important questions that we can try to answer in this whole field. Is there some form of, or a degree of intelligence somehow related, either within or directing, like robotics, of intelligence? And if you've read my book, in the back, there's a number of pages devoted to this subject of intelligence. And I have to say publicly that I'm coming to the opinion that the answer is yes. Yeah. And for me to say that, I'm retired now, so I'm not going to lose my job. But I honestly have to say that there is evidence that supports the hypothesis, or even the assertion that there's intelligence behind the phenomena. That still doesn't say where they come from. That's
right. Exactly. Yeah.
It's a totally different question.
Correct.
You might say it's the Pentagon.
Well, so when we're looking at the UFO phenomenon and in that sense, trying to, judge intelligence, what are some indicators that suggest that whatever's behind the UFO phenomenon is acting intelligently?
I'd have to go get my copy of the book and turn to that page. But as I recall, I broke the book deliberately into different chapters. Chapter 1 was friendly human behavior, right, that initiated the contact. And I found quite a number of interesting cases there. Persons out walking their dog at night and they see a light or an object come near above them, and they wave at it. Okay, well, that's just friendly behavior. Or they might have a flashlight, or they flash the flashlight at it and get a response back. Or a pilot flying along minding his own business, and an object comes along one way, and so the pilot somehow wants to communicate, either out of fear or curiosity. He wiggles his wings. Okay, he does this.
Yeah.
The object does this. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's friendly. That's not aggressive. Second chapter in the book deals just with cases where the human behavior is aggressive, angry, violent. And I found that was the largest number of cases. Let's think about that, the nature of man. Okay. It says
Yeah.
something more about us than it does about the phenomenon. Shooting guns, rockets, bows and arrows, throwing rocks, a very wide range of aggressive behavior, meant either to protect the human because he's doing it out of a defensive reason, or offensive because he's angry or even fearful, that would lead to that kind of aggressive behavior as well. Wonderful story from the Korean War, which I wrote in one of the chapters of a Korean book, Advanced Aerial Devices Reported During the Korean War. Published that years and years ago. And it's only cases taken from the Korean War period. But that private, Wall was his last name, he reported to me and to John Timmerman of CUFOS the account he had of a CE-5, a close encounter of the fifth kind during combat, in the Iron Triangle near Chorwan, with the enemy up to the north side of them, and they're aiming artillery. He's in an artillery battalion. Very impressive, believable story by a veteran of the Korean War. A lot of details, a lot of useful, I wouldn't say scientific details, but from the larger picture, they all fit together. So that was another example of human aggression. Finally, there is a chapter in that book that has to do with mental contact, which Stephen Greer follows. He believes that works, and he tries to find if it does. And he may be receiving some heat for doing that, but you have to give him some credit for striking out in a new creative area or approach that hasn't been tried before.
Right. And I think what's important about that too, and I've had contact experiences, and after the experience is something that the realization had dawned on me. In so many of these cases, even that Jacques Vallée and J. Allen Hynek reported on, and so much so that Dr. J. Allen Hynek created the terms high strangeness to implicitly direct attention towards that aspect of the phenomenon. And again, Jacques Vallée with Dr. Eric Davis, they wrote the 6-layer model of anomalous phenomena, and the psychic component or mental contact is something that's reported in so many encounters that there's something there to it. Maybe we don't understand it with the way that we think about it is in a certain way, is how we're trying to understand an advanced technology potentially interacting with us. Right. So I do think that is such an important topic to discuss. And again, we were talking before, but even what's discussed in the ATIP slide 9, right? It's talking about cognitive human interface, which I discussed with Lua Elizondo here, and I've discussed with others. But there is an aspect of the phenomenon that seems to delve into that, psychic phenomenon, mental phenomena, or as SAIC wrote when they did their study, anomalous mental phenomena. And of course, people like Dr. Kit Green and Dr. Gary Nolan have been looking at individuals who had reported this, who also have an augmentation in the caudate nucleus of the basal ganglia of the brain. But were there any specific cases in that book, the CE-5 book, that also stood out to you?
Well, the Korean case was interesting from the standpoint that the response that the object gave back to him firing a rifle bullet at it and actually striking it, it was armor-piercing round he had in his M1 rifle, that the object itself, he said to me, first of all, changed from an orange color. First of all, it had come up the hill from a lower altitude to slightly above their altitude where the guns were emplaced, the howitzers. And the first thing that the object did was to change brightness and color, and it went to a very bright white. The second thing it did was to start to move around very erratically, as if it's saying, try to hit me now. Okay, it didn't like to be fired at, I guess. The third thing he said it did was it emitted a low frequency sound that reminded him of a diesel locomotive engine. Okay, well, those are very interesting three specific behaviors of the phenomenon, CE-5, in response to the human shooting a gun at it, all right, and hitting it basically. He said that the next thing that happened was the guys in his battalion started getting their guns firing at it as well. And he said after his bullet hit and ricocheted off the surface apparently, and it went into this gyration, all the other guys in the group started firing the big calibers at it. And he said none of them would reach the surface of the object. There was somehow he liked the word force field. We don't know what it is. So let's fast forward now a number of years, and this is also in the book, where two hunters are out hunting, I think, ducks on a foggy morning somewhere in Southeast America. I don't remember where it was. It's too many years now. They're out hunting ducks with shotguns, and they hear and see a large metallic object slowly coming above them from one side to another. And one of the guys aims his shotgun at it and shoots it, fires shotgun at it. And he described in his report, the object went through the same 3 steps as the Korean object did in the same order. Think about that. Now, you can say that's a sign of intelligence. I don't put it in that category myself, but there's something that adds realism. The only possibility is that those two hunters could have read the soldier's account somewhere, which wasn't published, by the way, at that time. He didn't relate that to John Timmerman until much later. So I think they have to be telling a pretty accurate account of what happened. That's my analysis or interpretation of that. So again, the Korean case, I think, is a good one, followed up by this other case I've just mentioned from southeastern America. I think Arkansas or Mississippi, somewhere in that region. But the book has 243 cases documented there, and analyzed on different criteria to try to look for patterns, to try to look at what could support an intelligence hypothesis. Okay.
Yeah. And do you recall the, as I believe it was 1992 or 1993 volcano, the Mexico story with CSETI and Stephen Greer?
Oh, yes. Yes, he told me about that.
Yeah, that was another.
What about it?
That was another fascinating case, which,
Yes.
Isn't reported on as much as I would have liked to seen it reported on. Do you want to say anything about that case in particular?
No, not particularly. It's pretty well documented.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the only witness.
Right.
Yeah, he had other people with him, and that's important. That really is important. Well, let me ask you a question, if I may. You said you've had some kind of experience, but you haven't really said what. Would you say it was a CE-5?
Some were, yeah. I mean,
some.
Well, because the first couple that happened, I didn't initiate. However, during the fact, there was an obvious kind of interaction, and that definitely gets into the high strangeness aspects, because some of the interaction, there was this insane level of synchronicity that led up to one of the encounters that included a daytime sighting of a fireball, right, in a clear blue sky.
Mm.
And as soon as I thought to it, holy crap, that's a UFO, it starts to move, right?
Uh-huh.
And, that was one experience. And there's a number of others. So after a number of these experiences happened, I said, I had to find an answer to this kind of thing, right? I'm off on this exploration, basically. And I came across the work of CE-5.
Mhm.
So after learning about it, and when I heard Stephen Greer talking about it, I'm like, there's something there, because the way he's describing it is exactly how I experienced it. So that's, there's certain nuanced details you couldn't know unless you would have experienced it, in my opinion. So
Mhm.
so I took what he was saying was seriously, not to mention also because I saw the Disclosure Project and saw all the witnesses he'd gathered. So then I said, okay, I'm going to try this, right? I believe it will work, because when I heard about it, I was like, why didn't I think of that? And even I got your book early on, too. So I tried it, and there's been a number of times where I've done CE-5 and
Mhm.
had a number of witnesses to some pretty remarkable events. So
Can I ask if you did, how many of those you did alone by yourself, as opposed to having other people with you?
oh wow. I mean, I've done a lot more on my own because it's easy to. But I've done many with groups, right, with people who
Oh,
are interested in doing it.
I
But
see.
there was also times where I did it and pulled witnesses over, and family members, and said, hey, come out here, look at this kind of thing.
Mhm. Okay. And how successful do you think you were in attracting the attention or bringing it in or whatever?
I mean, there's no question in my mind that there was a direct correlation with my participation and the event occurring. Completely, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
for sure, that's
Uh-huh. Okay. Now, I have to ask another question then.
yeah.
Uh, do you think that you're being initiated into something?
Right. So that's the question, right? Where does it truly begin? Right.
Yeah.
So give me your angle on that initiation aspect.
Well, it is unusual for human beings on this planet to experience an anomalous event. And in fact, that's one of the chapters in my first book, UFO Phenomenon, the Behavioral Scientist. How do adults process a brand new experience that they have as an adult? It happens all the time as a child. That's normal for a child. But how does an adult do it? Okay. And so psychologists go into this a lot. They really do. So that when you are dealing with your own experience, you're faced with a lot of conflicting, I would call it garbage. Garbage is a pejorative word. I don't mean it negatively. A lot of irrelevance, maybe that's a better word, irrelevant experiences you had that don't fit. And so you're trying to pare it all down and get to the core, which is it real? Am I going crazy? Anyway, I've interviewed a lot of people who claim close encounters and abduction, by the way. And I've been impressed with their believability. They believe 100% it happened to them, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And the question is, do I? And from a science point of view, I wasn't there. Nothing was recorded. No records were kept. It was a private experience for the people involved. And so from a science point of view, it's almost zero information content. I would like to see the science of ufology or UAP research go in the direction of science that collects more useful data for scientists to look at. And that was one of the objectives of writing Observing UFOs, which was a series of articles. Originally, I wrote for APRO, if you know about APRO,
Yeah.
a long time ago, trying to help the man on the street do a better job of reporting, recording, keeping track of his or her experience so that others could come along later and make some sense out of it, rather than just saying, I saw a light in the night sky, which has zero content, of importance to us. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So going back to your own CE-5, which it may or may not be, but let's say it is, did you record anything? What is outside your brain?
Yeah, right.
Did you make any drawings or recordings of time and place and all that?
I wrote about the time and the place. I mean, I have all that documented. I didn't take a picture. So out of all the experiences, I mean, some of them I was just so much in shock that there was something going on and I couldn't even.
Right.
Again, I went through the whole process of, are you seeing things? Are you going crazy? Is this really here? You got to grab a witness so they can see it. They see it. Yes. Kind of thing. There's been a few occasions where we did CE-5 subsequently, and there's been a few pictures and video, but nothing that you can point to and say that's completely anomalous phenomena. Within the entire CE-5 field, there's a few interesting videos, I would say, that some of them are very interesting, but the videos on them by themselves aren't going to really make or break kind of the bigger reality, because you can say that's a genuine video. It looks authentic, but then to say it's extraterrestrial spacecraft or an interdimensional spacecraft, that's science can't make that leap, and because of that, there's a certain group of people that automatically will discount it, right? And I get it. It's a big thing to take in, right? Especially if there was some kind of program to conceal the reality of it from the American public, or
So if I read between the lines you've just said, you really are still at the stage of a personal, private experience that you're trying to understand, as opposed, now here's the option, and that is to help the larger body of, let's call it science or technology, to get involved and to do a serious study of the phenomenon. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really hoping people do. I'd like to bring attention to the issue.
But are you documenting it and sharing it in a way that expands into the science community, makes it credible?
I haven't. I know there's some people who have put reports in, but there's no real place that you put reports in for that I know of. And there's UFO organizations out there, but there's I don't want to name anyone in particular and saying they're doing bad things, but there's been examples of somebody submits their case to a UFO organization and it doesn't really go well. But I'd like to see CE-5 studied in a similar fashion as remote viewing was. And you wouldn't need terribly much to get a good study done, right? And I'm confident if they did the study, they'd get some kind of reports of anomalous phenomena. I mean, again, given variables, if ultimately the phenomenon has to kind of participate, right? Because at the end of the day, the phenomenon is either going to show up or it's not, and it's their call,
right?
Exactly. So there are complex kind of variables in place, but I think it's doable. I absolutely think it's doable, and I think that CE-5 is something I appreciate about it is I think it's repeatable. And one of the realizations that I had during the experiences was that I can tell somebody all day about this, and they can completely believe me, but that doesn't have the same effect on an individual as if they had that experience
Oh,
themselves.
sure. Absolutely.
That
Yeah.
kind of direct experience has a transformative quality. Again, it's kind of similar to John Mack's Passport of the Cosmos. Once you have that contact experience, all bets are off and everything's on the table.
Right. Right. And a new reality has been opened up.
Right. And so that's why I think CE-5 is in part so important.
Mhm.
And not only does it tell us something about the UFO phenomenon, but also about ourselves and our potential capacities and capabilities, and so much more to explore kind of in between those lines.
Sure. Have you thought about contacting Steve and signing up, so to speak, providing your expertise, working in parallel somehow? Yeah,
Stephen Greer.
yeah.
I think nowadays that I think people need to branch out. I don't think it should all be under Stephen Greer or
No,
anybody
no.
else.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I
Yeah, there's
think,
always room for that.
yeah,
Absolutely. Sure.
I think that, I mean, there need to be a number of initiatives that move in that direction with CE-5. And, the first one or the second one or the third one might not work, right? I mean,
Right.
in an experiment, you might have to do it 1,000 times before you get it right.
Sure.
It's
We may be
so
talking about a whole new scientific discipline here.
right. Yeah.
Right.
And there's so many interesting aspects involved with it. And, what me and my friend, the Hermetic Penetrator, have called interactivity, the quality of the interaction is it's unique and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and it's complex and it's fascinating.
Right.
But so getting a bit to the behavior of the phenomenon, you mentioned in your book, you go over kind of positive interactions versus when people act with hostility. So in those regards, were there different kind of reactions from the phenomenon given the circumstance?
Well, as I recall, there's a lot of cases there, and there's a lot of diversity then. But as I recall, a fairly common response was avoidance, that the phenomenon didn't want to be shot at, and I don't blame it. And avoidance in general, whether it was silence or turning dark against a sky background so it couldn't be seen, or moving quickly out of the way, or putting up a defense of some invisible shield of force or whatever, as we heard from the Korean case. So I guess I would encourage people just to look in the book and to do their own reading and to update the book. The book's old now, it's been out quite a while. And how many other documented, well-defined cases can be found to make a new book? I encourage someone to go out and try to write another one.
That would be fantastic. That's actually a great idea. And I believe, at least some of the material, the material's there. You just got to find the good ones. Basically, it's available because, there's a number of, even if you want to talk about, Christopher Bledsoe just came out with his book, but, his case was well reported and there was a kind of interaction that went on there. But I do want to shift gears again a little bit. Given we're talking about CE-5 and interactions, what are some of your thoughts about UFOs and as related to the psychic phenomena?
As related to what? Psychic
Phenomena.
Oh, whew. That's a heavy subject.
It is.
That's a frightening subject. It raises the issue of what is consciousness.
Yeah.
And does the skull of the human being block any frequencies or not? And there's debate on that. It's a complex subject that I guess I would rather wait and let history teach me, because I don't have anything to teach it.
Yeah. Another interesting book of yours, which I hadn't been able to get a copy of actually, but I was very interested in it because, some of your books are out of print. You have a book called UFO Phenomena and the Behavioral Scientist. So can you talk a little bit about that book?
Sure. I was editing it basically and contributed a couple chapters, but each chapter was written by a professional in different fields from their perspective. And back in the 1990s, when it was being put together, 80s, it was 1980s. There was no book like this because no publisher would touch it. No publisher wanted to be known as the publishing of these kind of books. In science now, this was a serious science-oriented book. And so I had psychologists contribute chapters, a psychiatrist, psychologist, a sociologist, an engineer, and I believe a physiologist. But the point is this: I was trying to collect an assortment of points of view, and each one could choose any subject they wanted. I didn't tell them what to write about. And so many of them presented chapters about cases they'd studied themselves. And one of the chapters was about Hollywood imagery that might be captured in the consciousness of Americans through mass media and be showing up as reality somehow. That was an interesting chapter. A lot of illustrations and drawings and so forth, which I think could be important. So at any rate, that particular book was published by Scarecrow Press. And Scarecrow, is my understanding, at least back then, maybe not now, had almost every major library in the country on its distribution list. So that book is showing up in little and large libraries around the country. And it's been very well received. It's gotten some good reviews, and I'm pleased for that. And I have to tell you that CE-5 hasn't gotten any reviews, and it's as if nobody's read it. And I'm still disappointed at that, except I'm glad to hear that you've read it.
I think it's a must read for anybody that's researching UFOs.
Oh, thank you.
Honestly, it's great to have seen somebody take on CE-5 and report on it and communicate on it in a different way than, say, Stephen Greer would. Especially somebody of your background and the way that in which you wrote it and reported it is going to be taken different than, somebody else. So, again, I think the different approaches are important. Mm-hmm. And if anybody can get their hands on the CE-5 book that you wrote, Richard Haines, I suggest people go on Amazon and try to get it. Are you able to get it formatted somehow to Kindle? Because the paperback is,
No, I'm not into that.
Yeah,
I don't have that much time of life left.
Yeah, because the paperback is, I think if you go on Amazon, it's like $60 now if you can find a copy. Yeah,
okay.
It's not too steep.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that, but you can say that about a lot of books too.
Yeah, of course.
Sure.
So also, I wanted to, this is a speculative question, since we're here, right? Given all the research you've done, what are your thoughts on, the UFO phenomenon, versus a phenomena like, there being several different intelligences or possible sources for UFO sightings that are what we would consider non-human intelligence? If we were going to make that leap.
You're talking about ET?
Yeah. What do you think that there's possibly more than one source for what we consider the UFO phenomenon?
Oh. I have to say yes, yes, and the reason why, I don't say that just glibly, that I believe in God as a creator, and I believe He's infinitely creative, and I believe that that creativity is being displayed on our own planet. If you open your mind and your eyes and look around, you'll see His creativity there in all domains. So then the next step is to see Him creating life on all, not all, but a lot of other planets that will support life, and astronomers are finding a lot of them. And so to say that those extraterrestrials, whatever form they might take, some of them have space programs, and they've set out 1,000 years ago or whatever, and far more advanced than ours in our physics and engineering and chemistry and so forth. And so they've gotten here before we've gotten there. We're just getting started in our extrasolar research, sending out unmanned vehicles and so forth, and eventually manned vehicles as well. And so they beat us to the punch. So that's the basis for which I believe there's a multitude of different ET, if you will. And I know that this is a very controversial subject, and I will hear a lot about it from my friends. But to me, that's just logical. It's just logical.
Yeah.
Who am I to limit God's creativity? I can't do that. Okay. That's my initial assumption.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, yeah, if the universe is so vast, and again, if there was a civilization that was 10,000 or 1,000,000 years ahead of us, it's almost inconceivable as to what they would be able to create.
Right.
And the technology they could potentially utilize. Yeah, because I think, if you come to the idea of, the phenomenon is real, UFOs are genuine reality. It's not, at that point, it's not really far of a stretch to imagine that there's, one or more other, phenomena that could be responsible for what we consider the UFO phenomenon, especially given all the different qualities of interaction, the different types of craft we might see, and the different, levels of technology that we assume to see, that are reported, at least.
James, in your experiences you had, did you feel that there was a communication between them and you?
Yeah. Yes. And so, and at that time, it was very visceral and it was very literal. And I'm a meditator and what have you. And again, over just observing different experience over the years, my perspective on it has shifted a bit, because again, at that point in the beginning, I was taking it very literal. And as time has gone on, I'm unsure if that was my interpretation of it. If it was, again, I don't think so, but if it was some kind of manipulation where, they were implanting thoughts and feelings or whatever, it's possible. I can't write that off. But it felt genuine. But could it have also been symbolic? Or if the UFO phenomenon is something so advanced and it was just trying to use concepts that I would be able to understand and be familiar with in a way to relate, so to speak. I don't know which one of those it was, but in short, yes.
So if somebody asked you what was the message they gave you, could you have an answer?
Oh, yeah, Yeah. And again, it would be through a lens of perception. So
Stop having wars and stop polluting the earth and that sort of thing.
I had visions of things like that. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Um, in my own research on abductions, I'll just divert a little bit into that if it's all right.
It's fine.
Um, Eddie Bullard, a professor and a very good researcher on this subject of abductions, has categorized a number of events that almost always happen leading up to the abduction or involving the abduction afterward, pre, during, and post. Well, I'm getting a bad image here.
Yeah, your screen's going a little haywire.
Yeah, what's going on here? Maybe somebody doesn't want me to talk about this. Okay. In my own not interviews, but counseling with people who claim to have been abducted, I find that his list of responses, if you will, fit what I was finding. And one of the very early initial responses of a person who's home at night alone, for instance, a woman doing dishes at the back in the kitchen looking out of a window into the dark. One of the first things that happens is what I call the alerting response. And it's usually a light, but sometimes it's a sound that causes the person to turn and look towards that direction. And so I got this idea, what if that alerting, orienting response is a key which allows a better access into the nervous system visually. I call it basically a photic, I forget the name of it now, that I used years ago. I've never published this, by the way. But the point is, you look at the occipital cortex back here, the back of the head, the shape of the skull, all right? It's like this. And it's basically a parabolic or antenna or reflector. And so parallel rays can come in and then be focused down to a point, the focal point of that mirror, right? So I did research on the water content and the reflectivity to different wavelengths of the bone, the human bone. And there's a difference between dead bone from an anatomy, a person who's been in a car accident is now dead, no water there, versus the reflection and absorption of those those energies coming in to water content bone. And then I said, well, what portion of the brain lies at the focal point? So that if we're looking this way, okay, right towards you, and you're sending energy of some kind, you want to get my head oriented so that you can come in and be focused by the brain, the cortex, and not the cortex, the skull, back of the skull. Now, I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's a line which I looked at quite thoroughly, and there's a possibility there's something to that idea. And I just throw it out, never published it, never told hardly anybody about it. But to me, it's kind of a creative idea that ought to be explored by someone, a group of MIT people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, that's why I'm glad you're in the field. I wish you did publish something on it, but it's important to be discussing these kind of approaches, right? Because I think, in doing so, we're going to learn a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And
if the phenomenon is as complex and mysterious as we think it is, so far from science that our science can't touch it yet, it's going to take a multidisciplinary, very creative, thinking out of the box kind of an approach to even get close to it. And so far, I don't see very much of that happening.
Right. It seems like that kind of discussion is now just beginning in the public, because there are many more people nowadays that are open to the reality of the UFO phenomenon thanks to people like Lou Elizondo and Leslie Kane, and I mean, for decades and decades of people who have contributed over the years to the study and research and engagement with the UFO phenomenon. But, more recently, whatever thin ice was there broke. And we're in different territory now where, you have people like Dr. Gary Nolan, who, is a very serious research scientist at Stanford University, who's openly, publicly spoken about this on podcasts and TV. And he's proposed a kind of very unique way to get academics involved, and more academics are getting involved. And I think, that the reality of UFOs being established, of, people call confirmation or disclosure, it is important in the sense that if you have all those people on board now, if somebody gives them the green light, I think many people would be interested, number one, and number two, there's so much I think that would come out of that. And I think we're just beginning to see people asking that question, is how can I get involved? What studies can be done? So it's really extraordinary to be witnessing this firsthand right now.
Well, one of the motivators for scientists is money.
Yeah.
And there's no funding that we know of, not major funding, that's required for this level of work. SETI fortunately had government sponsorship for its passive microwave listening for signals, again, for intelligence signals, basically. But other than that, there's been almost no major funding available. And publishers have been closed-minded and not accepting manuscripts from scientists. I've had a number of my papers turned down and sent back. Now, that sounds a little self-serving, but it happened. And so Peter Sturrock at Stanford, and others put together the SSE, Society for Scientific Exploration, many years ago now. And it's about the only journal I know of that will accept these kinds of anomalous subjects, basically. Can I go back briefly? Talk about a interview I had with a Brazilian farmer who he and his wife lived in a little shack, let's say, in a plot of land right on the Amazon River. And he happened to be invited to a UFO conference in Rio de Janeiro years ago. And I was a speaker there. I happened to have lunch with he and his wife. And he told me the most fantastic abduction story I'd ever heard. And I won't go into details, except his wife was a witness to him being taken aboard and supported everything he said. But what he told me was that once he was inside the craft, the two beings that had escorted him and literally carried him aboard the craft, one of them came and sat at a control panel, like a pilot seat, if you will, with instruments and whatever. The other one stood behind him, so he couldn't see him. And then after a period of time, he said it was as if they were trying to describe their controls or some technology or something, as if he would understand them, which he didn't. He was standing there awestruck and kind of paralyzed and kind of looking around a bit. And the 4 foot tall being, let's say, who was sitting in front of him, got up, walked to his right, and walked towards a solid metal wall. There were no instruments on it, no doors or anything, like just a solid piece of stainless steel, let's say, and merged and went right through the wall until he was invisible. He went kind of slowly through it. And Satius was his name, this gentleman I'm describing. he said he was flabbergasted. He's never seen anything like that. And then the being standing behind him tapped him on the shoulder or took him by the hand. He didn't go into details, turned him around and motioned for him to follow, to do what the first alien had just done. Well, he said, no, I can't do that. That's a solid wall. And the other guy behind him repeated his request, I guess, more forcibly, I don't know. And so Seixas starts to walk towards the wall. And he told me that he literally went through that wall and showed up on the other side of it, turned around and looked back, and it was a solid wall. Okay. It wasn't like a one-way mirror kind of an event. Here's my point. What if we, in our technology, our great technology and brilliant minds on this planet, could make an opening in a solid wall that would maintain the outline of the person within a ½ inch or so, and then close up immediately afterward, as opposed to doors on hinges now, which have been around for how many million years? And doors in, and the flies and the insects come in, and the hot air goes out, and cold air comes in, and so forth and so on. To me, this is a creative hint that the technology of this craft that came down in Brazil was demonstrating to a Brazilian, and thus to me eventually at this conference, and now me to you. You're in New York, and maybe some viewers eventually. I'm not saying we know how to do this, but I'm saying we should try. You know, is this virtual reality, virtual technology? I don't know, but it's a great idea to develop a door, an entryway that we can go through bodily in our 3D form, our physical form, and just have an opening the right size temporarily for letting us through, and nothing else but us. Does it make sense?
Yeah. So
to me, that's creativity. That's not what I'm saying, but what the Seixas told me he saw. Now, could a Brazilian farmer make up that kind of a story? That's what the skeptic would say, that he saw it on a science fiction TV program or something. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, and they, Dr. Diana Pasulka had written a book called American Cosmic, and it actually discussed some different scientists that were having experiences. One of them we know now is Dr. Gary Nolan. That's been publicly disclosed, that these people had contact encounters, and because of the encounters, it inspired different technologies and inventions, which is that's a fascinating concept, because even just in this kind of indirect interaction with the phenomenon, in a sense, without it landing and disclosing itself, there's still all these consequences, so to speak, for better or worse. And that gets into the idea of Jacques Vallée had called some of these like crash sites gifting fields. And I wonder, based on some of that, if you have any insight or comments on Jacques Vallée's control model, like the phenomenon acting in a way that's guiding our evolution to a degree.
Yeah, we've talked about that to some degree, and I think he's onto something. If the phenomenon exists, and if it is intelligent, it's very likely a lot more intelligent than we are. So given those precepts, beginning starting point, why wouldn't this advanced intelligence want to communicate? I asked you if you felt you'd been communicated with, right? And I've interviewed a lot of people who say, yes, they have a message. They end up with a new message in their mind they didn't have before. That's communication, right? Or imagination, but I think it's communication. So yeah, I think Jacques is really onto something there. And it calls for the involvement of social scientists who are now hiding in their ivory towers. Come out of the ivory towers. Get involved in an exciting field of research.
Yeah, I agree. I'd love to see more people involved in the subject. And again, I have seen it happen and it is occurring, but we're 70 or 80 years behind, at least from the 1940s, when this issue became very modernized and popular, and the idea of unidentified flying objects and as intelligently controlled vehicles from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there anything you would like to say about UFOs and flight safety in particular? Yeah.
Sure.
Aviation safety.
Sure. Ted and I wouldn't have gone ahead with NARCAP if we hadn't found physical evidence, recorded cases from the National Transportation Safety Board, for instance, who does top-notch research, by the way, where the phenomenon is either distracting the pilot, which is not good. You want to fly with full attention on your airplane. Navigate, communicate, right? The phenomenon might get in the way of the airplane flying along, which causes the pilot to have to deviate, to change course or altitude, or to descend, basically. We found cases where the nearness of the phenomenon to the airplane, this is the phenomenon, this is the airplane, the closer it gets, the stronger the electromagnetic effect is on the airplane. The instruments might change their settings. The compass, for instance, will vary in its pointing direction, or the automatic direction finder, which is not good. That's partly how you fly in a straight direction, or the many other human cockpit systems then are influenced by the presence of the object, which come back to normal usually when the phenomena goes away. That tells you that it's a signal strength issue, basically. A number of good cases like that in NARCAP files, which, by the way, all of our research is published and it's all on the internet, narcap.org. Just go there and look under research. I encourage people to do that. You'll find some really interesting cases there.
Yeah. And again, you were a chief scientist there for a number of years.
About 20 years.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. You must have came across and spoken to some incredible witnesses over all that time.
We did. Yeah, very impressive witnesses. That's right. And I'm not about to look a guy in the face and say, you made this up.
Yeah.
Not when his job is on the line and he might get fired.
Yeah, and speaking to that, can you talk about the importance of pilot witness testimony?
Oh, yeah, I'll give you an example. And Ted likes to tell this story as well. That a co-pilot in a major American airline, I will not say which one, was, I guess, with his wife and family, were going across near Area 51, about Area 51. And he happened to stop and get a little souvenir wallet card, which I haven't seen it myself, but he said it was an extraterrestrial visitation card or something like that. It was a souvenir of the place he stopped in for coffee, I guess, or gas or something. He put it in his wallet and forgot about it. And he said he was flying one day in the right seat across the country and talking with the pilot. No, he was in the left seat. He's the captain. I'm sorry. That's right. And he happened to remember this card in his wallet, and he pulled it out, showed it to the first officer. I guess just they were bored and wanted to talk about something. Well, come to find out, after they landed, the co-pilot turned him in. And this pilot told us that he got a request to come see the psychiatrist, the airline psychiatrist, just because of this. All right. That's how sensitive this whole culture is to this very important subject. To me, what you and I are talking about is really important. Maybe for the future of the country, the future of the world, the future of science, perhaps, but it's not a historical subject at all. It's an ongoing, real life, real time set of information that we've got to cope with. And you, in your own lifetime, are coping with your experience, right? You haven't stopped. You haven't stopped. Well, the pilots who've seen these things are forever changed. They're never going to stop. They're involved. You talk to a Navy pilot or whoever. Once their reality has been confronted like this, they have no other direction but to continue. To do otherwise is a clinical denial, which might put you into a psychiatric realm. So I guess what I'm saying, kind of in conclusion here, that what you're doing is important, and you should do what you can to get as educated as you can, and then collaborate with others. Don't go it alone. That's the kiss of death in a symbolic sense. That to me is a dangerous thing to do. That if you had, not you, but if anyone has had a close encounter, tell someone you love. Share it with someone. Get it out. Don't hold it inside. Document when and where it happened. Take as much memory as you can. Pull back and record it all right away before it fades. And some will fade, not all of it. Some will be repressed, and you won't be able to get it out without superhuman approaches, methadone or hypnosis or whatever and so forth.
Yeah.
I guess that's my advice, particularly to you.
Yeah, for sure. And I really appreciate having you on, Rich. You're like, super, super brilliant, and I'm really grateful that you have done all the work that you have, everything that you've contributed to the field. The books you've written, NARCAP, all that. So I really appreciate your time and having you on. And do you have any parting words to the audience, maybe?
Well, I'd have to know who your audience is, because I'd like to speak, in a pointed fashion that makes sense and has some real value for their own lives. When we look at UFO phenomena from a wider lens, we find that it can show up at any time, any place, unexpectedly. Well, what's the implication of that? It's very simple. Everyone becomes a potential witness. If anyone on this planet can be a witness sooner or later, doesn't it make sense that all those witnesses can contribute to science by doing a better job of remembering, reporting, recording what they experienced? It still doesn't turn it into scientific quality data, except perhaps for psychologists and sociologists. That's okay, but at least it's a step in the right direction. The history of science supports that in terms of identifying planetary regression in orbit and so forth. It doesn't take PhDs in astronomy to do what needs to be done here. It might take a collaborative effort, I should say, by a whole lot of different disciplines coming together and working as a team.
Yeah, and I sure hope to see that happen.
Me too.
But again, thank you so much, Richard, for coming on, joining me and talking with me. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
James, it's been a pleasure, and I wish you the best of luck. And I hope that you'll have another encounter.
Thank you. You take care.
Bye-bye.